Yes, hello everybody. I'm Andreas. I'm from Copenhagen, and I'm part of the Gehl team. But also, I was asked now we were coming here if I would do a presentation on what was just called active transportation, but it will be a presentation on pretty much on Copenhagen, but very much also how maybe things from Copenhagen can inspire all other cities. But first, I'll say a little bit about myself. This is me, and I worked for the city of Copenhagen for 7 or 8 years, and I also spent 1 year in Canada, where I had a good excuse to take a leave. Because I had a baby, so I went to Vancouver in British Columbia and worked there for a year. So I had some experiences in North America. I went down to the US also a few times when I was there, and I like a lot about the US. Also the cars you have here. We don't have so big cars in Denmark. But what I like most is using mode of transport that fits to what you're doing. And I think for a lot of trips, it's great to have a car. But traveling in cities, there's a lot of trips where it's much better to do your trip in other ways. And that's some of the stuff I will speak about. We're not that many, and it's kind of informal. I was even asked if I wanted a beer, so I had a beer while I do the presentation. So you're very welcome to interrupt me with questions if you have questions on the way. I've been asked to speak for about half an hour, so I'll try to do that. And but please, again, if you have questions along the way, just ask them. Otherwise, there might be some questions afterwards. Just a little bit about the company Gehl, and now we're here to do some work for Columbus. And Gehl very much have this approach that everything, in fact, is about focusing on the people first and creating cities for people. That is what it's all about. And there's a lot of link with that to the work I did I've done when I worked for the city of Copenhagen. Because one thing in Copenhagen is that we have very, very few cyclists. In fact, I think these kids, they would definitely not consider themselves cyclists. They see themselves as pirates more than anything else, probably. And I brought this picture of my neighbor, Heidi, and she's on her bike, but she's just been shopping. There's like 5 shopping bags on that bike, and she's a doctor. And I would call her a shopper, but she's definitely not considering herself as a cyclist. And I think that's an important part of this about walking and cycling in Copenhagen. You don't speak that much about it. Like, I'm sure you do not meet up with people and speak about walking and meet in walking clubs or whatever. And it's a bit the same in Copenhagen. You don't speak so much about cycling. You just tend to do it. And that was why Anne had mentioned that I've used this term that cycling is like brushing your teeth. So I felt I had to bring a picture of somebody brushing their teeth, because again, a lot of the work also I've been involved in also in other cities is in fact about how do we make walking and cycling just a very normal, natural thing to do and not something special. So that would also be part of what I'll speak about. Speak a bit about background on Copenhagen, because I think I've just been in Columbus for 3 hours. It reminds me a bit of where I was born in Denmark, Aarhus, which was a great city with some hills and many more trees than in Copenhagen, and a big university, very nice city as well. So far I had a very good stay here in Columbus, but of course I haven't seen much. So I'll speak a bit about background in Copenhagen, and then I'll talk a bit about what are we doing currently in Copenhagen to promote cycling and walking, also a bit about public transport, but since we're not especially good at public transport in Copenhagen, I'll try to not speak too much about that, but how public transport interact with the other modes I'll speak about. And then, because all cities are different, so I don't have this now, I will give advice, but I have some thoughts on if Copenhagen should start promoting cycling and walking again, what might we do differently, or what might we do more of, and maybe some of that can inspire other cities as well. One good thing about Copenhagen, when you're speaking about especially cycling, is that it's rather flat. As you can see in the picture, it's also rather dense. That is good for promoting cycling. Then we have the climate. There's something wrong with the colors on that graph, but the top one is how warm it is in Columbus, and it is much warmer here than in Copenhagen. But I had a fun experience this afternoon. I was sitting next to somebody and we were speaking about, so how is it to cycle here? And I thought there must be some months where you can't really cycle. And I would think because it's so warm. But they said, yes, that's true. There's 3 months during the winter where it's like rainy and it's not very nice. And I was kind of flabbergasted because in Denmark we cycle in snow and so on. But anyway, the climate is different. I think it must be a challenge sometimes in the summer months here as well because it gets so warm. But one thing we have in common is that we have quite a lot of rain in Copenhagen as well, and I think sometimes you get rain as well. So, but obviously there's some structural things that matters when you want to promote cycling or walking. Just a few numbers on Copenhagen, because sometimes you hear if you get people to cycle or walk, it's not good for business or whatever. But in fact, Copenhagen is one of the top 5 wealthy areas in Europe. And also, if you look back to '95. There's been an increase in jobs in Copenhagen. There's been 20% more Copenhageners. But at the same time, we've seen also an increase in trips, but a quite dramatic decrease in the share of car trips. And that has very much been the goal for the city, because the more people we have walking or cycling or using public transit, in the end it saves money for the city, because it's more expensive to build for cars or whatever. So we're quite... we're happy with those numbers in Copenhagen, but again, to show that this is about promoting walking and cycling that can be good for the overall status of the city as well. This is just to show how the blue color at the bottom is the market share for cycling, and that has been gradually increasing since '95. So now if we look at the trips to work and education in the city of Copenhagen, the bicycle has a market share of more than 40%, which also is very different to Columbus, where I think it's like 80% or 90% that takes a car or drive with somebody in a car to work. But one thing about so many people using a bicycle in Copenhagen is we don't in fact have that many people walking. That is the top, because so many people take their bike even for shorter trips. So that is one of the things we're working on in Copenhagen, also to keep making it attractive to go to walk. This is just the mode share again for Copenhagen. So again, the context of working with these things are different also, because in Copenhagen, like more than 50% of the voters in local election, they use a bike when they go to work during the week. So again, that changed the whole context of working with these kind of things a bit. I brought this picture though, because one thing is that when cities want to change things, I think the story of the cargo bike in Copenhagen is kind of interesting. This is a cargo bike, and until like 15 years ago in Copenhagen, to have a cargo bike was really a niche. That was only people very much into the environment, kind of strange people. But now what we see in Copenhagen is that in fact 25% of the families with 2 kids, they have a cargo bike. And that is probably because people have found out that using a cargo bike is very convenient, and if you're not going that far, you can just dump your kids in them, you can dump your groceries in them. And so in this aspect, Copenhagen have also seen a very fast change in behavior when it comes to transport. And maybe a few of the other numbers, because sometimes it's said that, oh yeah, you only cycle or you walk because you don't have a car. But in fact, we have seen an increase in the car ownership in Copenhagen with 50% in the last 15 years. And at the same time, we've seen increased cycling. So you can manage, if it's attractive to walk or cycle, then you use your car for the trips where it makes sense. The Copenhagens, they take the car to the IKEA or to the summer house or wherever they go when they go on longer trips. But during the week, they cycle because that is the most convenient for them. Also, when we look at who cycle in Copenhagen, it's pretty much everybody that cycles. We looked at income or gender or what kind of work you have, and that is something also we try to work with when we market cycling. That is a very normal thing. It's for everybody. Just very briefly, this is a historic development of cycling in Copenhagen, and just to give a very brief overview of this is the old days in Copenhagen, where we had almost only people cycling, and then we had trams. And then we saw a development pretty similar to many other Western cities, where we have very much focus on cars. We were kind of squeezing out the bikes, squeezing out the pedestrians. And that was like in the early 70s, and we had the low point of cycling. But then, to political decisions, we started putting in bike lanes on the most busy streets and kind of managed to turn the development around. And now in Copenhagen, what they have is a problem of now the cycle tracks built in the 80s are kind of too narrow. So now it's a problem. We have to expand the cycle tracks. But also that gets back to the similarity in some of the discussions cities are having. Because to expand cycle tracks, you also need to take out either car lanes or car parking. And those discussions can definitely get very, very heated in Copenhagen as well, as I'm sure they can get in Columbus and other cities. It's always or very often a matter of how do you allocate the space. And I'll get a bit back to that. I think the lesson from Copenhagen, and it's not that many places you might have a picture like this, but what happened in Copenhagen in the late 70s and early 80s and helped turning the development around in Copenhagen when it comes to promoting cycling was that there was a big push from the citizens, in fact. This is a demonstration for better cycling facilities in front of the town hall in Copenhagen. So it might be hard to imagine here, but still this about citizens taking action, speaking up. That was very much what changed the development in Copenhagen. And then, of course, we were very lucky in Copenhagen that we had politicians who listened to the citizens and actually changed the course of how the city was planning the infrastructure and the transport. And I think today a lot of the stuff Copenhagen are proud of is very much, in fact, from things citizens said, hey, we don't want you to do it that way, you should do it another way. So this is about listening to the citizens. At least in Copenhagen, that was turned out to be a very good idea. A bit about the urban space. This is pictures from Copenhagen in the 50s, and also there's been this historic push after there were cars pretty much everywhere to instead create places for people. So there's been more and more of these places also where we've been able to argue it is good to put in urban spaces instead of just, for example, car parking. And now the thing in Copenhagen is, as this picture shows, where we have the situation of people staying longer and longer in the urban space, and which of course is a very, very good sign for the city and a sign of this about investing in the public realm has turned out to be a good idea in many places, many cities, not just in Copenhagen. Very briefly on this, we've worked a lot in Copenhagen with how do we argue for public spaces, how do we argue for better cycling conditions. And one thing especially about cycling, there's so many good things about it, sometimes you get almost tired of hearing of all the good things because, it's like I even get tired of all these things. And I think it's very important to remember always that cycling and walking conditions is just a mean to an end. It's a mean to get to a city that's good to live in, where it's good to do business, where it's good for people to live. And you don't have to use all the good reasons all the time. It's very important to, at least it's my experience, to use those reasons that make sense in the situations you are in. And that might differ quite a lot from situation to situation. What worked a lot in Copenhagen when it comes to cycling was these like numbers and cost benefits, and that works in some areas where you have to argue for stuff. I'll not go through these numbers, but it's about being able to calculate what are the advantages of different modes of transport and put numbers on it. It's good in some instances. Other times it's better to be able to kind of put a picture in people's mind. And this is just to illustrate the health impact of cycling. And in fact, it's so healthy if you start cycling to work, back and forth, just 3 or 5 kilometers, 3 miles a day each way, that is so healthy that actually you could start smoking and you're just as healthy as you were before. And when you think about how much speak has been about smoking and you just quit smoking, and in fact, if you start cycling, you can continue smoking or you can start smoking, it's the same thing. And then one thing I noticed when I worked in Vancouver and in Calgary, it was that these developers of apartments, apparently they thought pictures of people on bikes is a good way of selling expensive apartments downtown. And that is just another partner. I think it's important to look for these partners when you want to promote cycling or walking, whatever kind of motive they have, but to work with the people that have the same interest. And I don't know if these developers were interested in cycling, but they were definitely interested in the image of cycling to sell the apartment. So there might be more than you just think you have a common interest in. What we've seen in Copenhagen is that in general public life is changing. This is, you could say, We have a lot of necessary activities. When we go back 100 years, almost all the stuff that happened on the street were necessary activities, people that had to do something there, work or transport things. And what we see now is that we have more and more of these, what is here called optional activities, when we sit outside, have a beer or have a chips or whatever we do, play basketball. And this is about being able to plan the city so they're attractive for these optional activities is something also I think we're working a lot on in Copenhagen, and which is very much also the purpose of some of the thoughts going on here in Columbus. Just see. And this is just an example from Copenhagen about having harbor bath. And I just saw this article the other day in your local newspaper about rafting, and so it's the same thinking, I think, also. And you have a lot of these opportunities in this city. I was quite impressed by how close the river is to this part of the area and how good it looked down there. I'll go a bit fast through how we promote active transport in Copenhagen at the moment, but I'll say a little bit about the infrastructure we work with, a little bit about how the planning is used, and a little bit about communication. First of all, in Copenhagen there's a big emphasis on understanding, so why are people choosing the mode of transport they are? Because in general most people are very rational. If people use the car, it's often because it's faster, it's more comfortable, it feels more safe than other modes. But also we can see in Copenhagen, if people walk or if people cycle, then it's because that's the most convenient way for them to transport themselves. To focus on this and kind of believe in that people are in fact quite rational when they make their choices when it comes to transport, has at least worked when it comes to promote cycling in Copenhagen. And what also of course matters is how you compare with other modes of transport. If there's no congestion for cars, if there's no parking problems, you will have less people wanting to do other things. But still you might have a lot of people who want to walk or cycle if you have good conditions for that, or using public transport. In general, again, the focus in Copenhagen is just about seeing cycling as nothing special. It's just a mean of transport, and it has to be seen that way, and just have to create the quality that makes it competitive with other modes. And so for Copenhagen, it's just about getting from A to B, high quality, and for Copenhagen or for the city, it's again, as I said, it's a mean to an end. And the focus is very much, I think, the same in most other cities. It's about connectivity. You have to have a good way all the way. If there's just 500 meters in the middle that is bad quality or just one huge crossing, then maybe you don't want to take your bike, or at least you don't want your kid to take the bike. And that is very much a focus in Copenhagen. What is also a focus is, we call it conversational cycling. But this is about being able, in fact, to cycle next to each other, to have a conversation, because when you go in a car, you can speak with your kid or you can speak with your friends, and that is quite nice. So it's nice if you can bike and have the same opportunity. And then also, of course, how long time does it take to cycle? There's some pictures of bridges. Doesn't have to be bridges. It can be all kind of shortcuts through parks, across squares, whatever. But this is about also for people cycling, the travel time matters, or for people walking. And shortcuts are great. I have a dad, in fact, he collects shortcuts, that's how much he likes them. He kind of remembers them in different cities. And then also in Copenhagen, we very much see cycling, because there's so much focus on cycling, as a vehicle for other improvements. And that would be the same, I think, here. If you do other kind of projects, there might be an option for improving cycling conditions or walking conditions at the same time. So a lot of different ways you can promote cycling. One of the more cheap ways, in fact, is how you synchronize the traffic lights. Doesn't seem very interesting, but in fact, the speed, how you synchronize the traffic light shows a lot what is the focus in this city. And one thing is to synchronize them for 20 kilometers an hour, that is like 15 miles an hour, which there are on some roads in Copenhagen, so you don't have to stop on your bike. It is also about, for example, I just skip this. How long does pedestrian have to stand and wait before they can cross a big road? How fast do they have to run if they're crossing a big road? So there's a lot of prioritization, there's a lot of politics in this, but it doesn't cost a lot of money. So that's one of the spaces, one of the things we worked a lot with in Copenhagen. I think it's possible to work with in almost all cities. In Copenhagen, like the bread and butter of the system for cycling is separated cycling facilities. And one part is when we have a cycle track, where we have a curb to the sidewalk, then the cycle track, and then the road. But it doesn't have to be like that. It can also be cycle lanes, like you have here. I think one big difference from North America to Denmark is that in Denmark we always, if we have a cycle lane, we put it inside the parked cars and not outside. So kind of the cars are protecting the people on bikes instead of the people cycling are protecting the cars. And I think that's for me personally, it's a big difference. And it's quite a lot of places it's possible to switch it around. In fact, also in Copenhagen we do quite a lot of these trails or passes away from traffic. I've seen there's many of these kind of good examples, and I've seen in North America as well, and that's also part of the system in Copenhagen. Then we work a lot with the crossings when it comes to cycling. The crossings are often where you also very much have to interact with traffic. And this picture also shows that we have a lot of cars in Copenhagen. There's like 60,000 cars on that street. But there's also like 30 or 40,000 people on bikes. So of course, again, you have to work with all those kind of means of transport. But this is about working with the crossing. Sometimes you need to do a lot. But also there are a lot of smaller measures you can do. What is very normal in Copenhagen is we push back the stop line for the cars. So then you have a head start if you're on a bike, and if the car is turning right, you have a much better view to the bikes. So there's a lot of small measures you can do, and that is being done in Copenhagen. And also we have in Copenhagen streets where we kind of mix traffic. If just the speed is kept down for the car, you don't have to build a lot of stuff. If you keep the speed down, you can easily mix the different modes of transport. Then bicycle parking. We have a lot of quite bad bicycle parking in Copenhagen, so I'll not go into that. What I will say is that I think especially also with the climate you have here, this is a picture from Vancouver, where I worked out in a suburb, and there's a parking lot for cars with quite a lot of room, and there were very few bikes, but there was still no parking for bikes, so you had to lock your bike to a tree. And this about end of trip facilities, I think it's important in Copenhagen, and might be even more important in cities where you have less bikes and also where you have a very warm climate, so maybe a bit more people want to take a shower or whatever they need to do if they arrive on a bike. And then this about partnerships. That's one thing I'm really impressed by in the US, how much you work together, the public sector, the private sector, just a thing like this today. Everybody working together on getting the bike ride up and running. And there's really these partnerships to find the most funny places. This is the Suncor Energy Center in Calgary that in fact had quite a lot of people cycling through their headquarters. So this is about working together, public-private partners. We're trying to do that in Copenhagen, but in fact I think you do that a lot better in the US. Public transport is a very important part of the network in Copenhagen, but also combining public transport with cycling is an important part of the system. And this is our train system that really caters for people on bikes. They found out that they can buy tickets, so they really like them. They've even put that picture in the left corner is a pump, so you can pump your bike while you're waiting for the train. So they really want to help make life easy for people on bikes. What we don't have in Copenhagen, but what you have in many places in North America, is the opportunity of combining buses and bikes. Yet another example of this about combining the different modes of transport, and that might be very useful, especially when you have longer distances. Skip this. Just a nice picture. The very basic thing, I think, and sometimes it's forgotten, is this about, it's all about getting access to where you want to go. And if you do facilities for walking or cycling, but if they don't lead to where you want to go, it doesn't help that much. And that is tough sometimes, but that is very much has to be, I think, very much the focus of the planning. Where is it people want to go? How do they want to stay there? What kind of environment do they like? Cycling in Copenhagen is very much part of public life, and this is just a picture of public life in Copenhagen when the sun shines. It's not like that all the time, but what I like about it is there's like 15 or 10 bikes in that picture, but you hardly notice them. And we also have this harbor that for many years the city was kind of turning its back to the harbor in Copenhagen, but now everybody kind of wanted to get down to the harbor, a bit like I imagine the river you have had. I've heard for some years it didn't really look towards the river, and suddenly a lot of things are happening where you want to face the river. And we've seen that development in Copenhagen as well, and it's been very forceful. Also what we've seen in Copenhagen, we started this about promoting public life in very small parts of the very city center, but then it became a success, and then we've seen this wish to create nice urban places where you can walk and where you can use a bicycle spread out from the city center. So that has really happened in Copenhagen the last 50 years. So now also the suburbs, and there's being invested in nice urban places and better conditions for walking. Also, we've seen in our city, in Copenhagen, a lot of development. How do we design the public spaces? You're getting more and more clever as you go on, I hope. At least we hope that in Copenhagen. Not always. We make some mistakes sometimes, that's for sure. We also see now more and more this about creating urban spaces where you can do things, where you can be active, is one of the trends in Copenhagen. I like this girl. She seems pretty happy with life at that moment. Cycling, that is again, it's a different context we're working in, because in Copenhagen it's very much like a Monday morning. These people, they just want to go to work. They don't want to be more active than they need to. They just want to get to work. So again, all cities have a different context to work in. But what is in common for cities is that you also work with planning, good old-fashioned planning and regulations, and that can also achieve something. And this is just a very simple example from Copenhagen, where it's a law that all taxis, they have to have a bicycle rack in the bottom of the trunk. So you know, if you go out cycling, visiting friends, and you get too much red wine or whatever, it starts raining, you can always get your bike with you home. And it's a very small thing, but it matters a lot when you're speaking about mobility and how to get around in the city. And it's just somebody who made a clever rule once. It's not something that costs a lot of money. The same thing is working with developers. You can have norms for bicycle parking, or you can say you have to put in some kind of bike lane or whatever leading to what you're building. And again, it doesn't cost that much money. It's just about having it into how you do your planning. I'll just taste my beer. I think I have 5-7 minutes left. I'll just speak a bit about how we work with the communication on actual transport in Copenhagen. And I think what we try very much is, or what has been done from the city's point of view, is saying to everybody that walks or cycle in the city, kind of in the way you design things, but also in other ways, saying thank you for walking, thank you for cycling, because you put people on the streets, which is good for urban life. You save us money in health expenses if you take your bike and so on. And you can do that in many ways. But this is about being focused on how do you send that signal in many different ways. That's been part of what the city's been doing. And this down in the right-hand corner says, yes, you can. We didn't dare to put a cigarette, so we just put a big cake instead. But it's the same kind of message. And what also I think is the case is that very few cities have big budgets for marketing, but what most cities do is they design the infrastructure. And in fact, infrastructure is an extremely powerful way of communicating to people. So this is about also being aware how are physical things designed, not just the function, but also the design. We have learned in Copenhagen that is a very effective way to get messages across. And this is just some of these examples. Like that footrest in the right-hand corner, I think we got more positive feedback on that small thing than we got when we built a new cycle track, because that was unusual and kind of showed people we respect you, we see your needs. So this is about also thinking about how to design the physical things, because it communicates very strongly. And this is a picture from Vancouver, I'm sorry, but this is also bicycle parking, and it's kind of hidden away behind the station. This is a train station. So this also communicates but I'm not sure the people that designed it, they were thinking about communication. They're probably thinking about the function, but for me, it doesn't signal quality, or we really want you to cycle. It more like, yeah, you're not that important to us. So this is about the design of the infrastructure we have learned in Copenhagen. That really helps a lot as well. And then again, having kind of a consistent message in the way you communicate on walking or cycling or using the urban space. Really try to do that. So the last thing was these 3 things. If Copenhagen should start all over again, what could Copenhagen maybe have done more of? And the first thing, in fact, is something where I've learned a lot in recent years. That it is about kind of not trying to do everything at the same time, being very focused on where do we get the most effect for the money we invest. And that can both be what is your target group. This is a picture of kids. We worked a lot with kids, but also people from countries where you're not so used to cycle. Maybe you're not able to cycle. How do you get these people to learn to cycle? Also, this is about working with partners, where I think there's a lot to learn from North America and Europe. We've started in Copenhagen to work with supermarkets, for example. Finally, they found out a lot of their customers arrived on bikes. So this is about really focus the effort and find out where do we get the most effect from the money. And the same thing with the infrastructure. You can't do like 10 corridors. Where's the largest potential, so you get the good examples, the good stories to build on. Another lesson from Copenhagen, what we have learned is that you have to have good quality, especially when cycling, but also when walking all the way from A to B, even where it hurts. And that's where it sometimes takes some tough political decisions. But in Copenhagen, at least, the experience is unless these decisions are taken as well, it's hard to really promote cycling or walking. And this picture is a street in Copenhagen where for 15 years, I think the administration has said, oh, you cannot put a cycle track on that street, it will be chaos. The traffic will break down. But then we had a mayor who said, I don't care. I want a cycle track on that street. It's important connection, so you have to put it in. And it was pretty unpleasant. You had buses and these granite columns and a lot of cars and whatever. And the cycle track was built, and it worked fine. The traffic didn't break down, and it really helped the cycle traffic along that road. But it only happened because there was a politician who said, I want it. You have to do that because that's important for my policies. You have to do it. Yeah, it's just this about cycling sometimes and also walking. You get the impression that, oh yeah, you can handle this. You don't have high quality all the way, but it would be a bit the same if you could see this on a freeway, and if you could say to a car driver, please get out of your car and push it for 50 meters and get back in. It's no big problem, and you would never accept that. And again, this is about just treating walking and cycling as a normal mode of transport, so you don't design things like this for cars, and you shouldn't design similar things for bikes or walking, or at least you should try to avoid it. The last thing from Copenhagen, I think we have learned, and we're still learning in Copenhagen also, is that sometimes you kind of think, will this really work, and should we do it, and we can't know for sure. But at least in Copenhagen we have learned a lot about, yes, it can be done. People really like to walk or cycle or whatever if you create good quality. And so this is about being even more aware of finding the good stories, finding the data and use it. That is definitely something we have learned in Copenhagen. And that should be the last example here. Because we have this long walking street with a lot of commercial stores in the dead center of Copenhagen. And there was a huge discussion when originally the street looked like this. And everybody was saying, no, you can't make that into a walking street. It will be disaster, and it's raining all the time. It's really not good to do this, and it's not the Danish culture. Don't do it. And it was a huge thing. And now it looks like this, and full of people, and the shops are much better off now than they were before. And even when it rains, there's a lot of people. So there's I think in Copenhagen we're getting more and more like we believe in the good experiences, and still we can feel, oh, should we really do this, and is it a good idea? But this is about really believing and looking at what have worked before and believing in that. And the last thing is this about when you want to promote cycling and walking. This is about remembering the messaging and making it normal and being very aware how do you portray cycling and walking. And this picture is just to illustrate that I kind of, when I worked at the city of Copenhagen, I used all possible means to market cycling. Even my own daughter, I use her as a marketing tool, you can see. So that was the three things I think that if Copenhagen should start all over again promoting cycling and walking, we might do even more of this. About really be aware where do we get the most bang from our money, and this about really have to think the whole stretch through the whole corridor, and this about it can be done. It's just about finding the data and being very aware also on how to tell the story of these things. That's it. With a beer and in a bar, and thank you for your patience down there. And if there's some questions.